The subcommittee will come to order. How many votes? How many? Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome, and thank you for being here. We'll be joined shortly by Ranking Member Bass and other members of the subcommittee, but we do have votes scheduled for 3:15. There will be a brief break for that. Then we'll come back and conclude the testimonies from our distinguished witnesses. For most of the 37 years that I've been in Congress, the House and Senate have been heavily involved in U.S. policy towards Sudan. For example, I've chaired 12 congressional hearings, including 2 markups on Sudan since 1996. My first hearing focused on chattel slavery in Sudan, and we actually had witnesses who had been slaves there, and many others, NGOs, who spoke of this egregious practice, followed by genocide hearings in the Darfur region, the persistent bombing of people in the Nuba Mountains, the Khartoum government's failure to abide by the 2011 agreement that created an independent South Sudan, and of course, myriad human rights violations and the government's historic relationship with terrorist groups. The Sudan government has long sought sanctions relief, and Congress and successive administrations have considered such relief as an incentive for Khartoum to reach and abide by various peace agreements. When I, joined by Greg Simpkins, our chief of staff, personally met with President Bashir in Khartoum in August of 2005, I spoke about Darfur refugees and visited 2 of the refugee camps, Mukjar and Kama camp, and spoke almost exclusively during the hour-and-a-half-plus meeting about ending the violence. President Bashir, on the other hand, focused almost exclusively on sanctions relief. The Obama administration, in its last days in office in January, purported to see justification in ending a sanctions regime built over decades. In its announcement on the easing of sanctions, the Obama administration declared positive actions by the Sudanese government in 5 key areas. 1, pardon me, rebuilding counterterrorism cooperation. 2, countering the threat of the Lord's Resistance Army. 3, ending negative involvement in South Sudan's conflict. One of our witnesses will testify later. Negative involvement was never really defined. 4, sustaining a unilateral cessation of hostilities in Darfur, South Kordofan, and the Blue Nile provinces. And 5, improving humanitarian access throughout Sudan. Missing in this list of positive developments is improvements in the overall human rights situation in Sudan, including and especially sex and labor trafficking. And I would remind our friends who are here at this hearing and my colleagues, Sudan is a Tier 3 country on the State Department's list, so it is an egregious violator, and the narrative in the report is an indictment, frankly, on both sex and labor trafficking. On religious freedom, Sudan continues to get a failing grade as well from the State Department and has been designated, again, a country of particular concern, or CBC, which subjects it to other sanctions. It is well within the government's ability to meet the standards in the 5 areas mentioned, and I would hope other areas as well, if it truly has the will to do so. However, the government of Sudan has never been known for its respect of the rights of those not considered Arab, such as Darfur residents who were persecuted despite being largely Muslim, or Sudanese who were not Muslim at all. There was the case in 2014 of Miriam Ibrahim, a Christian woman sentenced to death by the Sudanese court for refusing to renounce her Christian faith. The court also ordered Ibrahim, who married a Christian man in 2011 and was 8 months pregnant when she was arrested and imprisoned, to receive 100 lashes for adultery because her marriage was considered void under Sharia law. The couple had a child, a 20-month-old boy, who was also in detention with her. Imagine that, a 20-month-old boy in detention next to her, behind bars. I joined with a group of House and Senate members, including our subcommittee's vice chairman, Congressman Meadows, in working with elements of the Sudanese government in an eventually successful effort to vacate the sentence and allow Ms. Ibrahim and her family to come to the United States. That effort demonstrated and perhaps highlighted that there are some elements of an internally divided Sudanese government with whom we can work with towards a better future for Sudan's people, but it also confirmed that other elements are viciously opposed to religious freedom and other fundamental human rights. The Obama administration's justification of its decision on sanctions relief was done in the absence of any congressional consultation and presented as a fait accompli. It freed more than $30 million in unfrozen Sudanese assets, allows commercial transactions in all sectors, and signaled a new policy of more positively reviewing licenses to do business in Sudan. Commercial transactions prohibited as a result of the government of Sudan's designation as a state sponsor of terrorism and Darfur-specific targeted actions are still in place. The entire sanctions easing process will be fully effective 6 months from the date of announcement on January 13th, 6 months from January 13th. Today's hearing is intended to begin asking the hard questions concerning sanctions relief in order to facilitate improved relations between the U.S. and Sudan, if that will benefit the people of Sudan. Nevertheless, it's incumbent upon the U.S. government to honestly consider the conditions under which sanctions easing is justified. As stated earlier, the government of Sudan is fully capable of meeting the requirements outlined in the January executive order, but we must be sure of the extent to which that government is abiding by them and urge them to do more where necessary. Various reports indicate that attacks on civilians, including sexual-based violence, continues by government and allied forces. Even though human rights improvement is not one of the requirements in the executive order by the former president, we must not, as a government, ignore this aspect. Successful administrations and Congresses have worked hard to ensure that human rights concerns in Sudan are addressed. And I would note parenthetically, in this room, back in the year 2000, I presided as chairman of this committee over the markup of the Sudanese Peace Act. This has been a totally comprehensive and bipartisan effort over the years. And again, human rights is essential if we are to truly help the people of Sudan. Now is not the time to abandon decades of work, as I said, by men and women of goodwill in our government and many American citizens who have supported our efforts. We must also not forsake the welfare of the people of Sudan, for whom our efforts all this time have been made. If the government of Sudan is indeed willing to work with us to fulfill the aspects mentioned in the executive order and improve the state of human rights in Sudan, then for the sake of the Sudanese people, our government should make the effort to work with them. But it will do the government of Sudan and its people no good if we turn a blind eye to ongoing problems and fail to press for genuine improvements that are sustainable and that can be clearly demonstrated. As we await the appointment of the Trump administration officials tasked with making the ultimate decisions on these matters, the clock is ticking. We have assembled a panel of private sector witnesses who can give us an expert look, a picture of the status of adherence to the requirements outlined in the executive order and human rights in Sudan. We do not have a witness that is involved in humanitarian activities. We asked a few because of their concern, and it's a justified concern. Had they spoken out and done so with the candor that they would do, that could limit their ability to do business and to provide humanitarian relief inside of Sudan. This hearing is only the beginning of Congress's investigation into the matter. By July 12th, when the sanctions easing regime fully comes to fruition or into effect, we hope to know whether there is sufficient justification to approve this action or whether more work needs to be done. So this is a timely hearing, I believe. Again, we have a panel of truly remarkable witnesses who are extremely knowledgeable, and for that, I am very grateful for you being here today. And I'd like to yield to my friend and colleague, the ranking member, Ms. Bass. Okay, yield to Mr. Garrett.
Very briefly, Mr. Chairman, just wanted to take this opportunity to articulate sort of my concurrence with your assessment of the situation, but also to note the progress that's been made on a case that semi-parallels that of Miriam Ibrahim, and that being the case of Czech pastor Petr Yashik, as well as two Sudanese counterparts, Hassan Abdul Rahim and Abdul Manam Abdul Mawala, who are currently held in the Republic of the Sudan. I will say that my experience working directly with Mawia Khalid, the ambassador of the Republic to the United States, has been extremely fruitful, and that the Sudanese representation here in Washington has been very forthcoming and cooperative as it relates to our concerns in this instance, and we look forward to a positive outcome in those cases. That notwithstanding, obviously there are any number of steps to be taken moving forward, but I do believe and I want to articulate that establishing good faith and positive working relationships will actually help facilitate progress as Sudan works to move itself back into the mainstream of nations. And with that, I'd yield back my time, and thank you.
I'd like to yield to Mr. Swaze.
Mr. Chairman, I'm just waiting to listen to the witnesses. Thank you.
Mr. Donovan.
Thank you, Chairman. I just wanted to thank you for conducting this important hearing with votes coming sometime within the next 20 minutes. I'll yield my time for the witnesses.
Thank you very much, Mr. Donovan. I'd like to welcome our witnesses to the witness table. Beginning first, our witness up will be Ambassador Princeton Lyman. Is a senior advisor to the President of the United States Institute of Peace. He served as U.S. Special Envoy for Sudan and South Sudan from 2011 to 2013. As Special Envoy, he led U.S. policy in helping in the implementation of the 05 Comprehensive Peace Agreement. His career in government, including assignments as Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for African Affairs, U.S. Ambassador to Nigeria and South Africa, and Assistant Secretary of State for International Organizations. He began his government career with USAID and served as its director in Ethiopia. He has testified several times before this committee, and we always are so glad to welcome him back and to welcome his insights and his wisdom. We'll then hear from Mr. Brad Brooks Rubin, who serves as the Policy Director for the Century and is Policy Advisor to the Enough Project. In this capacity, he helps to lead the efforts of the Century to disrupt the corrupt networks that fund and profit from genocide or other mass atrocities in Africa. From 2009 to 2013, Mr. Brooks Rubin served in the Special Advisor for Conflict Diamonds in the United States Department of State. While there, he also contributed to the U.S. efforts related to conflict minerals in eastern Congo, particularly in the area of corporate due diligence. Prior to joining the department, he served as Attorney Advisor in the Treasury Department's Office of the Chief Counsel on Foreign Assets Control. Then we'll hear from Mr. David DeToni, who is the Director of the Operations for the Sudan Relief Fund and the Managing Director of TSA, a German-based organization created to assist the lives of the people of Africa, particularly the people of Sudan and South Sudan. Previously, he was Director of Operations and Outreach at the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom and a Senior Legislative Assistant to Representative Frank Wolf. He assisted Mr. Wolf, Chairman Wolf, in foreign policy, national security, and global human rights initiatives, and was co-staff director of the Congressional Human Rights Caucus. And then we'll hear from Mr. Mohammed Abu Bakr, the African Middle Eastern Leadership Project. He's a human rights activist, more than a decade of experience in the nonprofit sector. He has founded and served as director for multiple NGOs focused on humanitarian relief, human rights, youth empowerment, and peace programs across the Middle East and Africa. He has been hosted by many universities to address students on a variety of topics. In 2016, he launched the African Middle Eastern Leadership Project, or ML, the Arabic word for hope, a U.S.-based nonprofit organization that seeks to empower young leaders from the Middle East and Africa to build pluralistic societies. Ambassador Lyman, please proceed.
There we go. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Karen Bass, other members of the committee. This committee has, over the years, been extraordinarily attentive to the issues of Sudan and South Sudan. For those of us who work on it, we're very grateful, and I know you've had a major impact on the thinking and the policies in this area. Mr. Chairman, the future of Sudan is very much in its hands. So how do we reconcile these things? How do we the dilemma? The fundamental problem, in my view, Mr. Chairman, is that this government has to, at some point, find its way to the path of reform without thinking that that's a zero-sum game, that it's not afraid to undertake the kind of reforms that would bring peace and prosperity and democracy to the country. Other autocratic regimes have done this. South Korea did it, South Africa did it, Spain did it, Indonesia did it. Right now, there are some people in the government of Sudan who recognize this. There are a lot of people who don't or don't want to or think the task is too great, the risks are too great. So what do we do? Where's our role in this? We have leverage. We have leverage because of sanctions. As you pointed out, Mr. Chairman, it's a big issue for the government of Sudan. But sanctions are only leverage if they're not static, if they're used, if they're part of a process. Now, I realize that, as you pointed out, and I know our witnesses, very, very knowledgeable people, will indicate the imperfections not only in the situation, but the limitation of the tracks that you mentioned. We're talking about, I won't comment on the intelligence one, I don't have the information on that. The Lord's Resistance Army, unfortunately, both Uganda and the United States are pulling back on that. But the two that are most controversial are the limited amount of progress on humanitarian access and the peace process, the ceasefires. But I look at this differently. I look at this as a very limited opening of a dialogue. We haven't had a dialogue on these issues since 2013. They closed it off after the end of the South Sudan independence. And we have, and the administration had to work hard to open it. It's limited on both ends. It isn't a big roadmap all the way to perfect relations. We've tried that in the past. Too difficult, too complicated, too many variables. It starts limited, 5 tracks that have a lot of limitations, but the sanctions are also limited that are being lifted. Yes, they open up some trade and they do a number of things, but they're not going to lead to a lot of investment in South Sudan. There's too many variables. It doesn't include debt relief. It doesn't include state sponsor of terrorism. It doesn't include all the legislative sanctions which are in place. So it's limited on both ends, and the Sudanese can know that too. So the question is, where do we go with this dialogue? Obviously, you want them to at least perform on the 5 tracks that are put out there. But the big question, which you raised, Mr. Chairman, and others have talked about, is how do you get to the other issues, the human rights issues, the real peace process issues? And that, to me, is what we should be working on for past July, whether they hopefully make these, and what comes next, and what degree of sanctions additional, otherwise one might move. It has to include human rights and freedom of assembly. It has to open that door to dialogue and further work on the peace process. I'll just make 2 other points. We forget the role of the opposition. They're players here, and they control the agenda as well. The Darfur opposition is in disarray. Its leaders are all in Paris. The SPLM North is having a split. They have put restrictions on humanitarian access that I do not find logical. They are part of the process. They have to agree to cooperate as well. And I think we have to give attention to them and what their positions are, listen very carefully because they have a right to be suspicious, but at the same time question where we think they're wrong. I would make one other recommendation, Mr. Chairman. We have a lot of restrictions on our U.S. aid program in Sudan. You can work in humanitarian areas. Its development areas are only along the border in very limited areas. Supposing you gave U.S. aid a little more freedom, a little more flexibility, so that these sanctions, which allow more medicine, more agricultural inputs to come in, They could partner with NGOs in Sudan and other groups, make sure that those goods are getting out to clinics in the outer area, getting out to farmers outside. They don't get concentrated at the center. So we're opening up the economic system. At the same time, we're opening up a little of the political system. So I see this as a first step, an opening. It's part of a dialogue. It's going to be a long way to go. It's more like Burma than others. And I think in that sense, I think it's the right move, even though it's fraught with all of the problems you raised. Thank you.
Thank you so very much. And without objection, all of your full statements and anything you want to attach to it will be made a part of the record. Mr. Brooks, Reuben?
Thank you. Chairman Smith, Ranking Member Bass, members of the subcommittee, thank you for holding this important hearing and providing the Enough Project and our financial investigative initiative, The Century, with the opportunity to share our perspective on a country that has long vexed U.S. policymakers. As the chairman noted, Congress has a deep and bipartisan history of leading U.S. efforts to promote peace, human rights, religious freedom, and counterterrorism objectives in Sudan, and this is an absolutely critical moment for Congress to continue that engagement. It is a critical moment because this past January, as has been noted, in the waning moments of the last administration, an all-or-nothing choice on economic sanctions on Sudan was created. Either maintain the 2 decades-old comprehensive sanctions or lift them entirely. This false choice came out of a limited 5-track engagement plan developed in mid-2016. This plan is insufficient, as Ambassador Lyman also noted, because it doesn't address basic governance issues in Sudan, doesn't include crucial human rights and religious freedom issues, and removes the bulk of U.S. leverage without requiring any peace agreement for the multiple wars being waged today in Sudan. The far more sophisticated nature of the tools of financial pressure that are available today can be deployed in a much more nuanced way than sanctions on all of Sudan or no sanctions at all. Mr. Chairman, we believe Congress and the Trump administration must correct this course and do so now by developing a de-linked and independent human rights and peace track with the government of Sudan that would supplement but remain independent of the 5 tracks. This new track should focus on the United States' most pressing policy goals for Sudan: advancing human rights, religious freedom, essential democratic reforms, good governance, and ultimately a comprehensive peace. Without addressing these goals, the government of Sudan will maintain its long-standing patterns of behavior, advancing policies that have led to continuous deadly wars, religious persecution, dictatorship, mass migration to Europe, grand corruption, and affiliation with terrorist organizations that have marked its 28 years. Achieving the bold objectives in this new track will require tools that are more focused, sophisticated, and impactful than the dull instrument of comprehensive sanctions. Instead, we must use state-of-the-art financial pressures that target key elements of the regime and the corporate and banking networks that underlie it. The comprehensive sanctions in place now come from a previous era and were, as was noted by Ambassador Lyman, never robustly implemented. They nevertheless impacted the regime's ability to connect to the international financial system, especially in recent years, as sanctions enforcement triggered by a different program, Iran, caused global banks to review their systems and realize they were still banking Sudan through the correspondent banking network. Rather than giving up on this renewed leverage now, Congress should adopt legislation that ties a new suite of modernized financial pressures as well as appropriate incentives to the new human rights and peace track. The pressures we propose are not just a few more sanctions or variations on the broad measures of the past. It is a fundamentally different approach, shifting from one that is geography-based to one that is conduct-based, and using both sanctions and anti-money laundering measures. In this new approach, the measures would focus solely on individuals and entities that are responsible for major human rights abuse, grand corruption, religious persecution, conflict gold trading, weapons exporting, and undermining the peace process. These are the economic sectors that provide the regime its lifeline and the types of conduct that are most problematic. So that is what we should target. Unlike the past, we should not just use the broadest of measures or try to pick a few names and never update them as they morph into new entities. We need to use the best financial intelligence available, which our initiative, The Century, will help provide, so as to achieve our foreign policy objectives and protect the integrity of the U.S. financial system. For example, entities in Sudan like the National Intelligence and Security Service operate in ways not unlike entities the United States has targeted in Iran. In addition, conflict-affected gold and weapons exports provide much-needed, off-budget cash that is used to sustain violence and line the pockets of corrupt elites who have transformed the Sudanese economy into a private domain for their own enrichment. The United States knows how to target these kinds of systems. OFAC, FinCEN, and the State Department have done so in relation to Iran, Russia, and Burma, to name a few. We just need to be willing to do it with Sudan. Taking this course would be in stark contrast to the 5 tracks, which I will address very briefly. As my colleague Omar Ismail recently described in testimony before the Lantos Commission, some of the violence in Sudan has eased, in part due to the evolving nature of the force of the use of force in conflict areas, and we note that Sudan has demonstrated restraint with respect to Sudan and likely continued its CT cooperation. At the same time, as Omar and many others have testified, the restraint in some areas contrasts with continued violence in the conflict zones. There have been numerous violent attacks on civilians in Darfur. Government flyovers continue to threaten people in South Kordofan, including the Nuba Mountains. Worse, while the government of Sudan is allowing cross-border humanitarian access to areas in South Sudan affected by famine, parts of Blue Nile and South Kordofan remain restricted. Acknowledging both progress and areas where the 5-track plan benchmarks are unmet, we believe 2 things should happen. The interagency assessment process should continue, and an honest assessment made in July. Our expectation is that the 5 tracks will remain unfulfilled when viewed as an entire package, because at least 2 of the 5 tracks will not be in compliance. If the government is indeed non-compliant on any of the tracks, then the final step of complete removal of the comprehensive sanctions should be delayed for a sufficient period, such as 1 year. In addition, in response to the violence in Darfur, and as a way of reinforcing the need for serious engagement on all 5 tracks leading up to July, the administration should use its authority under the Darfur sanctions, which are not part of this plan, to impose asset freezes on those responsible for the violence. As with other sanctions programs connected to serious negotiations, the administration should tighten pressure along the way to reinforce those objectives while also providing relief. In the end, the fate of the 5-track plan and the comprehensive sanctions should be a lower priority because it creates a false policy choice. Comprehensive sanctions or nothing over benchmarks that do not fundamentally alter the nature of a regime that has wrought havoc within Sudan and the region for nearly 3 decades. Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, Congress should take the lead in designing a clear U.S. policy approach, one that deploys the types of modernized pressures that can generate meaningful leverage for creating real and lasting change in Sudan through human rights and peace track. Thank you for the opportunity.
Mr. Brooks Rubin, thank you so much for your testimony, and enough over the decades has been pressing for a better Sudan, and I want to thank you for your insights today. I would like, before we take a brief recess to catch those 3 votes that are on the floor, we've been joined briefly by Dr. Oscar Bichette, one of the greatest human rights defenders in the world, who spent years in the Gulag in Cuba. He was in solitary confinement many times. He's an OBGYN, a medical doctor, and has been, a group of us some years back nominated him for the Nobel Peace Prize because of his extraordinary work and his courage. So I want to just acknowledge him and thank him for his leadership for so many, many years, and now that he is free. I would point out that he testified twice before our committee. One time, he did it after he was under house arrest. He did it by way of phone hookup at great risk to himself while he was still in Cuba. And he testified before this committee and made a very, very strong and powerful statement on behalf of human rights. Thank you, Doctor, for being here. Again, I apologize to our 2 witnesses. We will come right back. It should only be about 15 minutes then we should have a big open time to get into Q&A. Thank you. Stand in recess. The subcommittee will resume its hearing, and Mrs. DeToni, I believe you're next. Again, I apologize for the delay, but we should be clear for the entire hearing now.
Chairman Smith, Ranking Member Bass, other members of the committee, I want to thank you for your long service on human rights in Africa, and both of you, I know you've been very involved. And your work here, as I wrote in my written testimony, your constituents may never know all the lives and the impact that you're making in the world, and I just want to thank you for all the service that you're doing. We've already mentioned, or other people have already mentioned, the 5 areas that are in the sanctions that the Obama administration temporarily lifted in January 2017. And I'm just going to run through those real quickly and then address my views on if those are valid rationale, and then try to focus on some recommendations for Congress and the Trump administration. First, on the issue of enhancing cooperation on counterterrorism. I have to say, I think that my view is probably simplistic, and I know it's hard line, but the sins of Bashir and the regime, I just don't see how those sins can be forgiven. They hosted al-Qaeda for several years. Attacks occurred on our embassies in Tanzania and Kenya. I mean, thousands of American lives have been ended because of Khartoum and Bashir's material support for terrorism. And this isn't even half the story on their support for terrorism. They need to be held accountable. You said at the beginning of this hearing in your opening remarks, you've held countless hearings on human rights, peace, I mean, coming on 15, 20 years. And so when are they going to be held accountable for these acts? And it's not like it's just another dictatorship around the world. I mean, these are people who are still in power, some out of power, who are anti-American, anti-Western, and their actions have had an impact that are diametrically opposed to the interests of this country. So the first thing is, I know it's simplistic, but I think that lifting the sanctions for cooperation on counterterrorism is not forgivable. And I think that they need to be held accountable for their actions. The nature of this regime in Khartoum is that they kill their own people. And they kill their own citizens. They don't even blink when they do it. They didn't blink when they were supporting terrorism or whatever they're still doing or not doing. And they haven't blinked in killing women and children intentionally. Particularly what I know about is in the Nuba Mountains. Dropping bombs on schools, hospitals, churches. I've seen them. There are holes in the roofs. Every school, every hut has a foxhole in it so that the children or the pastor or a priest can run and hide into a foxhole. Imagine. I mean, I was going to try to bring in some shrapnel from these bombs that have exploded and that have killed innocent people. And I didn't want to bring it in because I didn't know if I'd be able to get it through and have the hassle of it. But I've got them. Bombs drop, and if you're not in a foxhole, and you're within 100, 200 meters of this thing, it's going to spin hundreds of miles an hour, and it's going to cut off your head, cut off your arm, go right through you. So, I mean, that's the reality of what they're doing to their own people, and that's the reality of the nature of this regime. They're still in power. And I know it's a simplistic view, but that's the reality of what they have been doing up until very recently, and they can do again, into their own citizens. On the issue of humanitarian access, particularly in the 2 areas, to my knowledge, Khartoum has not allowed a single piece of humanitarian assistance into the two areas. People haven't planted crops like they would when there's peace and stability. The people of Nuba have been attacked and invaded for over 6 years now, since 2011. It's a war zone. So there's little food, there's no development, there's no building for the future. There are virtually no doctors. There's one surgeon in the Nuba Mountains. Woe to you if you get appendicitis and you can't reach Dr. Tom Katina, an American serving at Goodell Hospital. The humanitarian situation, particularly in the two areas, which I know about, is dire. And it's part of Khartoum's strategy, just like it was in the war with South Sudan, to deny the two areas humanitarian assistance. I will say this, I'll acknowledge one positive thing that I've seen Khartoum do, and that is, in an ironic twist, they've allowed in South Sudanese 100, 200,000 refugees, and they have a semblance of safety there. And as well, there are, I think, between 100 and 200,000 Eritreans who have fled the repressive regime in Eritrea. Now, Khartoum's doing this because it's in their interest. I don't think they're doing it because they think it's the right thing to do, but ascribing motives is neither here nor there. And the thing is, though, that they are, I think, using, particularly with the Eritrean issue, you're using this with the Europeans to stem the refugee flow and getting money and funding to keep the refugees in Sudan. So I think that they're gaining some benefit out of it as well. In the past several months, hostilities in the two areas has been greatly reduced. The aerial bombing, to my knowledge, has ceased. No major offenses or skirmishes or on any sort of scale have occurred. And both sides, the major sides involved, Khartoum and the SPLM North, have restrained. However, there's no formal ceasefire. There are no mechanisms to enforce the ceasefire, no modalities, no observers, so except for maybe the United States with these sanctions that we've used as leverage. And the fighting and bombing can begin at a moment's notice. The Comprehensive Peace Agreement, I need to touch on that because we keep having hearings and talking about Sudan, particularly as it concerns the two areas. Khartoum did allow the vote, South Sudan to vote for independence. But on many other aspects of the CPA, they just clearly violated the CPA, the Comprehensive Peace Agreement of 2005. In May 2011, Khartoum invaded Abyei, destroying, killing, looting, displacing over 100,000 Dinka who are indigenous to Abyei. And now there's an Ethiopian peacekeeping force there preventing any further outbreaks, hopefully. But that was a Khartoum clear violation of the Comprehensive Peace Agreement, and it included violence. The CPA provided for a popular consultation for the two areas. Abyei was promised a referendum. The citizens of Abyei, as we all know, were promised a referendum to decide which country they would belong in. That hasn't happened. But the CPA provided for a popular consultation for the people of the two areas. That hasn't happened. Instead, what happened? In May 2011, Bashir gave the SPLM North 1 week to disarm their army. And my understanding was the CPA provided for 1 year to integrate security and get security arrangements figured out between the SPLM North and Khartoum. Instead, it was 1 week, and then Bashir and his allies attacked and resumed the civil war, which has been going on within Khartoum and the two areas for almost 6 years now. From personal experience, the CPA provided for political participation and freedom of movement and assembly. When I was in Khartoum in 2009, when I was a staff member of the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, several members of the transitional government, the National Assembly, were marching up in a peaceful protest on the steps of the Assembly to present their problems and their issues with the way the government was going. As we were going out to the refugee camps, we saw thousands of Interior Ministry troops coming their way. And we learned later that the security forces had arrested these National Assembly members, beaten them up, kicked them, and we saw the bruises and we saw the impact upon this. And this was the beginning of the end of to me, in my mind, of the implementation of the CPA, particularly as regarded the two areas. Okay, so what are my recommendations for the new administration and for Congress? First, President Trump needs to appoint a high-level special envoy for Sudan and South Sudan. This person needs to have direct access to President Trump. The appointment ceremony should occur in the Rose Garden. President Trump should conduct a press conference. In his remarks, he should note the expectation that the special envoy should travel to the Nuba Mountains, the two areas, Khartoum, Darfur, Juba, South Sudan, and Sudan. To my knowledge, correct me if I'm wrong, Ambassador Lyman, no special envoys ever traveled to the two areas to see for themselves the situation on the ground. I believe they've gone to Khartoum, but they've never gone to the two areas. This needs to change. Second, the Trump administration needs to reset relations with South Sudan. Yes, South Sudan. As a signatory to the CPA and as a major stakeholder in the creation of South Sudan, the United States has a moral obligation to help the South move off the precipice of total collapse. And President Trump having a personal relationship with President Salva Kiir might help to improve the conditions in South Sudan and the region. Despite being two independent countries, Sudan and South Sudan's future are linked, and solutions to both political and civil war crises must be found. And it's in America's strategic and moral interest to bring peace and stability to the region and to these two countries. Third, within 6 months of today, President Trump should hold a regional conference in Washington, D.C. and meet with, invite and have attend President Salva Kiir, President of Uganda, President of Kenya, Prime Minister of Ethiopia, maybe a few others. Promote a unified agenda for peace, democracy, stability, and security in the region, and finding unified approaches to the problems in Sudan and South Sudan. Fourth, working with Congress, President Trump should either amend the January 2017 executive order lifting some sanctions, or ask Congress, the President should ask Congress to draft legislation, or you should just draft it on your own, concerning sanctions on Sudan. President Trump or legislation should make the lifting of sanctions reviewable every 180 days or annually, as you suggested earlier. And there should be a requirement the executive branch must submit to Congress in writing and to the President a rationale and review for action on sanctions towards Sudan. Such a review should be publicly viewable 2 months before the sanctions should be lifted. And it should be written such that the sanctions are not automatically lifted if the President doesn't take action, like they are right now. These sanctions, my understanding, will be automatically lifted unless the President revokes them or does something to them. The stoppage in the fighting in the two areas has been a positive development and needs to be sustained. And the sustained lull can create an environment and a situation more conducive to a lasting peace. Now, it begs the question as to why Khartoum has to do something in their own interest, in the sense of making a peace deal and ceasing to fight and kill its own people. But if a few select sanctions can be waived for 180 days or a year, and it keeps the fighting down and they're negotiating good interests, I think it's worth trying. Fifth, the chairman of the full committee, ranking member, chairman, other members should request a classified briefing from relevant agencies on Sudan's counterterrorism assistance to the United States. In that same briefing, the agencies should provide a report detailing the involvement of Khartoum and the extent of Khartoum's meddling and past activity and present activity in South Sudan and the region. After receiving this briefing, then you could ask those agencies to give the same briefing to other members of the committee and other members in the Senate and the Congress. I want to give President Trump and his team an opportunity to build on the fact that the fighting in the two areas has ceased, and the fighting can begin at a moment's notice. The region's waiting to see how President Trump will lead in the new Congress, will lead and amend, change direction, or build upon the work from previous administrations. We want to give President Trump the ability to lead in this volatile region and I believe that limiting some of the sanctions and limiting them for a little bit of time could lead to certain transparent, reviewable, and a certifiable process that involves the Congress and congressional approval and might provide leverage and better behavior from Khartoum. My hope is for the President to become personally engaged in the peace process in the Sudans, and for the President to develop a personal relationship with our allies in the region. I believe it's in the interests of the United States. I believe it's in the security interests of the United States to use the resources and levers of American power to promote peace and prosperity and freedom in this troubled region. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your testimony, recommendations, and for going there so frequently to be a first-hand witness. Thank you. Mr. Abu Bakr.
Ranking Member Bass and members of the subcommittee, thank you for affording me the honor to testify before you today and to share my personal observations regarding the impact of sanctions on the ground in Sudan. My goal is to provide you with the evidence that you need to act. You have statistics and you have social aggregate data.
If you could
And you
just
have,
suspend for 1 minute, and I apologize for
Sorry.
the rudeness of it, but Mr. Garrett does have to leave to meet with the Japanese ambassador, but really wanted to just express a few thoughts and maybe ask a question, and then we'll go right back and take as much time as you want.
Sure, and I apologize specifically to you, Mr. Abu Bakr, because I need to hear what you say. I'm going to take the testimony notes back with me. This is a very important subject to me by virtue of some of the activities that we've engaged in that we alluded to earlier as it relates to the release of some prisoners currently held in the Republic of the Sudan, and I really want to also tip my hat to you, Mr. Detoni, Mr. Brooks Rubin as well, Ambassador. Your boss is Frank Wolf, or your former boss is a really fine man who I think served Virginia and our nation very well, and it was my honor to count him among a distant circle of friends. What I heard here, and I would welcome the input of anyone, maybe I heard what I wanted to hear. My efforts reaching out to the embassy, the ambassador, and the Republic of the Sudan's delegation here in the United States have been obviously with a clearly articulated goal, and that is to win the freedom of these individuals, and even if it means that they leave the nation. We've obviously engaged in a relatively one-size-fits-all series of sanctions, and certainly for well-articulated reasons here today. The question that I have is, and I think you touched on this towards the end of your testimony, if we might not be well advised to try to find that carrot as opposed to the stick, even in very limited measures. What I've seen in my very micro interaction is a desire for an improvement in relations, willingness to be accommodating as it relates to moving in directions I think we would all find desirable where they feel it's in Sudanese interest, right? And I understand human nature is motivated by, I'm willing to do this if it's the right thing to do, and there's something in it that helps me and my nation. I think I've seen that, and I hope, obviously President Bashir's been there for a long time, and certainly for 11 years in one iteration, and since I guess '89 as president. But with the cessation of active hostilities, and certainly the dialogue that I've heard, the good faith comments that have been made to me, might it not make sense to slowly start to roll back sanctions and see if we don't see commensurate continued behavior? Is that, I mean, I understand the history, and certainly Darfur is something that the world can't turn a blind eye to, what's happening in the Nuba Mountain region, what we don't even know. But might it not make some sense to try to sort of give a little to see if we can get something that's in everyone's collective best interest? And Mr. Brooks Rubin, you, I think, are moving to speak.
Thank you, Representative Garrett. I think your point is well taken. I think the important issue to note is that that's, in some ways, that's the 5-track process that's been put on the table. The comprehensive sanctions, I mean, the 5-track process, unless it's completely amended and tossed aside, I think we're recognizing that process is underway. When that is completed, at whatever point, and those tracks should be honestly assessed, but at whatever point that happens, the comprehensive sanctions that are in place now being lifted, that's a significant carrot. That is a significant development. That takes away all of the restrictions that are in place now with respect to imports,
Not
exports,
not trying to be
banking.
rude, my understanding is that we anticipate the lifting of the sanctions based on the actions of the previous administration if the current administration agrees to it, and that's all up in the air. What I think
Right,
Mr. DeToni, and I'm not trying to argue with you because
Yeah.
I think we're on the same page here, suggested is if this is done in a sort of progressive step-by-step fashion, let me paraphrase a better political figure than myself, trust but verify, that if we give to the Sudanese things helpful to the Sudanese and continue to do so long as they behave in a manner such that we find to be more consistent with the spirit of human rights, then everybody wins, right? My experience in a vacuum has been wonderful, but I know there's a whole lot bigger world out there.
I'm
But
think
but
the
the-
trust but
but
verified part
it's
is right,
it was an
yeah.
all or nothing, more or less, all right? The previous administration
Correct.
said this is what we're going to do. We're on a 6-month clock right now.
it's all or nothing in terms of the sanctions for what is a limited set of actions by the government. I think what all of us are saying in different ways is we need to get the important issues, the key issues of peace, human rights, religious freedom on the table, and then that's what we need real incentives for, and there are other incentives that are still on the table, as Ambassador Lyman noted, with respect to debt relief and state-sponsored terrorism. But our view is, if you're going to put really the rest of the issues on the table, those core issues of human rights and religious freedom, that can't just be without pressure. There also need to be a different level of pressure to get there. And so it's a sort of different idea around what those sticks are. The stick we have now is a sort of big blunt club from 20 years ago.
Right.
Let's come in with more precision-guided tools that can
And
get
so
there.
we say, show me, and what I've heard is, and again, I'm looking at a tiny little slice, we want to show you. And I think if I can build on that for a moment, if you look at certainly there are self-inflicted causes for your famine in the South Sudan, but if you look at infrastructure, and who has access to the Red Sea and ports, et cetera, and rail facilities, albeit ones in dire need of some maybe U.S. assistance if everything goes well, it would help us to have a good relationship with the Sudan to get the food to the places that don't have.
No, if you could just, out of respect for Mr. Abu Bakar, I know you have that.
Yes, sir, and I apologize.
And
to
I
all
would
of
ask
you.
all of you to circle back to the questions, and they're great questions that Mr. Garrett has asked. But we'll maybe complete Mr. Abu Bakar's testimony, and then come back,
Well,
because I know you have answers to these questions.
So, but I guess if the Sudan plays ball, to use a colloquialism, it would be in the best interest of the entire region by virtue of just the ability to distribute food, et cetera.
I think that,
You can nod,
yeah, okay, go ahead.
shake your head no.
I
I don't wanna be
I don't want to
rude.
interrupt, I mean, it's just Chairman, and you haven't spoken, so maybe we could talk in private about this, not on the
I
record.
would invite
I'd
you,
be-
anybody at the table to reach out to our office. I'd love to speak with you, and I
Okay.
apologize. to the
And,
chair.
and for the record, come back and answer those questions.
Sure, sure.
Mr. Abu Bakar.
Thank you, I'm sorry. You can't.
My goal is to provide you with evidence that you need to act. You have statistics and you have social aggregated data, and you have political knowledge. What I want to give you is my story. My name is Muhammad Abu Bakr, civil and human rights activist from Khartoum, Sudan, born and raised. Inspired by the International Declaration of Human Rights, I've done the best I could to be there for those deprived of these rights the most. At an early age too, as Sudan has that tendency to force children to grow up way before they should. I grew up and spent most of my adult life in a comprehensively sanctioned Sudan. It wasn't an easy experience by any means. As a citizen, I struggled, and as a student, I suffered. The unintended consequences of sanctions that plagued the program put a heavy load on the average citizen of Sudan, and an even heavier load on the back of civil society in Sudan, and specifically on those of us in the humanitarian and human rights sectors. Despite the exceptions made for organizations working in this space. While I personally have been outspoken about these unintended consequences and joined the calls for reformation and modernization of U.S. sanction policy, I did not for a second doubt the importance of having them in place, or the rationale for their imposition. It wasn't hard to notice the strong correlation between the regime's financial comfort and violence. So against many of our personal interests, citizens and civil society, we supported the sanctions. We believed they were about bringing positive change and transformation of the human rights scene in Sudan. And holding on to the hope for the light at the end of the tunnel, we fully complied and fully backed the sanctions. So you can imagine imagine the deep sense of sadness and betrayal widely shared by many upon hearing about the US intentions to ease sanctions and on these conditions. Conditions that completely ignored the human rights and for the citizen of Sudan who suffered in silence for so long. In my written statement, I argued against the rationale for easing sanctions against Sudan and whether sanction relief was warranted to begin with. And I argued against each of the conditions set forth by the US government for easing of sanctions. I argued against the legitimacy of Sudan as a partner in the war against the Lord's Resistance Army and its methods, while the government of Sudan and affiliated militia are still engaged in recruitment of children in the exact same fashion. And I argued against Sudan being a part of the solution to South Sudan crisis, as that situation in that violent kleptocracy needs a serious international long commitment in building South Sudan's non-existing institutions. But none of that is as important as what I'm about to say. After the European Union recently dropped the ball on its commitment for human rights by striking an ethically and morally questionable deal to stop the African refugees and economic migrants hailing from Africa to reach Europe, and hired the very same Janjaweed militia that killed hundreds of thousands of people in Darfur, now rebranded as the Rapid Response Force, there is absolutely no other champion left in the corner of those of us in Sudan fighting for human rights and dignity for the human of Sudan. The flame of hope is fading away, and the way I see it, it's up to the United States and up to this committee to keep that flame alive. I see my time is running up, and allow me to close
No,
my
don't
remarks with
rush.
this. In the process of making, of thinking what to do with Sudan and thinking of what conditions could have been better for sanctions relief, please put yourselves in the uncomfortable shoes of an activist for human rights or a journalist who dared to speak truth to power, one of the thousands and thousands unlawfully arrested, tortured, and worse. Think of what would make things better for them and others like them. Think of me and the thoughts coming through my head right now. And the scenarios, and the very plausible scenarios playing in my head as we speak, about the consequences of me coming here today, for me and for people I care about and love back home. It certainly would have been nice if the conditions for sanctions relief included language that would make me feel a little less worried and a little more at ease. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Well, let me thank all of you for your testimony today and also for your patience. I wanted to get a sense from maybe Brooks Rubin, when the Obama administration was determined to ease sanctions, if you could talk about the benchmarks that they saw. In other words, we're going to back up a little bit, and this is what we expect to see from Khartoum. And then from Mr. Abubakar? Abubakar. You were describing what life is like with sanctions, and maybe you could pose some alternatives. If sanctions, if we continue along the direction we are, how do we get the regime to move?
I absolutely encourage re-engagement with Sudan. It's not something that I'm opposed to, essentially. I really don't think the comprehensive sanctions is the way to go, and that complete boycott is the way to induce any change. I do believe, though, in the modernized sanctions model put forward by the Enough Project could be a very effective way to go and re-engage with Sudan. I also believe when and if sanction relief is warranted, it should be completely human rights based, as that's, I think, in my opinion, the way to get to any other interest of the United States in the long term. Re-engaging right now on these sanctions, I'm afraid, will just leave the human of Sudan behind for the very long run, and I am afraid nothing will ever change should these sanctions be removed on these conditions.
Thank you. Mr. Brooks Rubin?
Thank you, Representative Bass. And I think that's, I mean, those are the issues that in some ways we would want to see in benchmarks for any comprehensive listing of sanctions is addressing exactly the issues that Mohammed and the other witnesses have testified to. I think the issues with the 5-track plan was that there weren't clearly established benchmarks. You had 5 tracks that were laid out. Obviously on counterterrorism, that's something that is, unless the classified briefing is held that Mr. Detoni referred to for you, that's not something that anyone's going to have an insight into. As to the other tracks, the executive order says that progress needs to continue, but that's not defined. And in terms of understanding from the interagency what they're looking for, it's still an amorphous sense. So understanding what continued progress on cessation of hostilities or humanitarian access is leaves too much to the eye of the beholder. And this is a regime, and these are issues that cannot be subjectively evaluated in exchange for a much larger piece. If we had established sanctions relief that was measured, some small piece of the existing sanctions regime in exchange for some progress on these benchmarks, then there may have been a different discussion. But you ended up with limited pieces of the issues, mostly regionally focused, questionable progress on at least 2 of them in exchange for what is at least the entirety of the economic sanctions program administered by the Treasury Department. Without benchmarks, without clear steps that need to be met, it is impossible really for others to engage and really assess that well, which is I think why many are calling for this extension of, at least on the 5-track plan. But from our perspective, wherever that 5-track plan ends up, really what's important are the big peace human rights issues that all of us have focused on here. That needs a much different set of benchmarks and a much different set of pressures as a result.
Ambassador, you have a viewpoint on this?
I fully agree, as I said in the testimony, that what's missing in these benchmarks is the focus on some of the fundamental political issues, including and especially human rights, et cetera. And that has to be the focus of the next round of discussion. Because if you just only stuck with these, they're kind of holding positions, but they're not definitive. But then one has to define what those steps are. What are the steps that you think are both feasible and meaningful? And I think there are a number in terms of political space, of stop harassing civil society and arresting people and torturing them. There's a lot you can do in that area. It doesn't still answer the question of a political dialogue that ends the fundamental problems of the outlying areas, but one can make some very specific criteria in that area that at least starts to give space, and then one has to deal with both the some of the others. So I think that is the key to the next round, but it doesn't wait until we get to July. In other words, that should be already part of the dialogue that's going on now, so that regardless of how you come out in July, you already have an understanding and agreement as to where this is going next. If you don't have an understanding on that by the time you get to July, you haven't accomplished a great deal. And so I think that has to start now.
Mr. Detoni?
Well, Congressman Garrett said trust but verify. I mean, I can't believe, allow myself to trust. I mean, given the history, all the broken agreements that have occurred, I can't, allow, and I don't think we should have it as a policy to trust Khartoum in this current regime.
What do you think should be done?
Well, I do think we need to tie the sanctions conditionally. I think the Trump administration needs more time to get their personnel in. I think that they've been slow to put their people in, and The administration needs to own this.
So you think they should put the sanctions back, the ones that were used
No,
up?
we should extend the sanctions for 180 days or even a year, because yes, they have violated almost every agreement to a degree that they've made with the CPA. They did allow the South to vote to secede. But peace, there is a semblance of peace, and there is some hope, I think, in the two areas in particular. And I think that the new administration and the Congress needs to try to give this some life. There was almost, and Ambassador Lyman could speak, there was almost an agreement on humanitarian aid. The Obama administration pushed very hard for an agreement in the two areas for the delivery of humanitarian assistance. And I think it was just too much, too late. And I think that the people who would not agree with it saw a new administration on the horizon and said, we just got to wait and see, and we'll go with the new administration. So, give the administration some more time, find these areas, get their people in, the administration. They need to own it, because it's whatever happens in the region, it's on their watch now.
Mr. Brooks Rubin, I know in the Enough Project, and I think you made reference to, it's the Century, is that what it's called? And I wanted to know if you could speak about that in terms of assets that you think are offshore.
Thank you, Representative Bass. Yeah, the Century is an investigative initiative that the Enough Project and other partners have launched to get at the question of if we're going to launch, if we're going to use all of these policy tools, we need to have the intelligence behind it to know where those targets are and who they should be. So with respect to South Sudan, we've been able to document quite a lot of the properties of and corporate holdings of the officials that are leading to that crisis. And with respect to Sudan, the same. So there are properties and assets that we're investigating around the region, and in other regions. And we've looked extensively also at the banking network and trying to understand how, as I referenced in the testimony, how the government of Sudan, even during the sanctions, was able to establish banking relationships that allow that allow money to move and ultimately even move through New York through that system. So trying to understand where those banking nodes are will allow FinCEN at the Treasury Department and other financial intelligence units and banks to zero in on where that money is moving and how they can stop it. Even if the sanctions were to go away, in many cases what you're talking about are assets that are the proceeds of corruption. They are stolen from the people. As that money moves through the financial system, banks can still go after it. The financial intelligence units can go after it because it's money laundering. So we are, I guess the last thing I would say on the assets is looking extensively at gold. We have a report that we just issued yesterday called Sudan's Deep State that looks at the gold sector, the weapons sector, the land sector, and looking at where how these sectors enable the regime and key leaders, key officials close to President Bashir, key entities I mentioned in my testimony, the NIS, an extensive corporate network that is enabling key members of the regime to move money around. That's where we can focus our tools. So with the Century's information provided to the relevant actors, the hope is then they can take and use these kinds of financial pressures we have used to get at other regimes. We need to be able to do that for Sudan. We need to be able to do that for the people of Sudan, to target those economic sectors and those actors and move away from this blunt instrument we had in the past. But you need the information for it. We saw with the Century that there isn't a lot of the resources devoted to gathering this kind of financial intelligence around East and Central Africa. We the U.S. government, devoted to lots of other parts of the world. It's needed for East and Central Africa, and then the Century was the ability to say, well, we can collect as much as we can, we'll turn that evidence over, and then hopefully use will be made of it.
Thank you. Let me ask you a number of questions and then take the ones you would like. Mr. Brooks, Rubin, you in your testimony pointed out that Sudan has used the provisional easing of the sanctions put in place in January not to begin the necessary reforms of structural deformities of the country's economy, but instead to order fighter jets and battle tanks from its traditional arms suppliers in Russia and China. And I would have a question, do you all agree with that? If you could elaborate on that. Let me just point out that with the Iran deal, which I thought was egregiously flawed on multiple fronts, including the procurement and development of nuclear weapons and the means to deliver them in Iran, sanctions should have been allowed to stay in place far longer to get a deal that was verifiable and real, rather than allowing them minimally after 10 years to have an industrial state capacity to produce fissile material. Well, human rights were deliberately left out of that negotiation, and the same thing happened with North Korea. We had Andrew Natsios, our former USAID administrator and a man who wore many hats within previous administrations, and an expert who also heads up a North Korea human rights organization, testify. And he said there too, in North Korea, human rights were just thrown under the bus, no comments, just work on the nuclear issue. And when that didn't materialize and no progress was made, matter of fact, just the opposite, they do have nuclear capabilities now, and they're ever perfecting the means to deliver them. Human rights were unaddressed. And now we have these 5 different mutually reinforcing areas where human rights are emphasized, to put it mildly. So if you could speak to the issue of what they're buying, and of course, what is Iran buying? Like perhaps Sudan, weapons, surface-to-air missiles in the case of Iran. You point out that fighter jets and tanks, battle tanks, are being bought. That to me would be a gross exploitation of the easing of sanctions. Let me ask you, who's in charge? You know, Bashir wanted to go to Turkey, and the European Union asked Erdogan to arrest him and send him to Hague pursuant to the ICC indictment, and yet he's traveled some 74 times over the years, although he did not go to Indonesia because several countries would not allow overflight airspace traversing by his aircraft, so that put the kibosh on that. But China had him there, as we know, and others have as well. South Africa as well, and there's a court case. Is he in charge? If maybe you could speak, maybe Ambassador Lyman, you might want to speak to that as well. Who really is calling the shots in Sudan? Are there other people in the administration who present a more benign face to us, the Americans, and to the Europeans, and to the Africans, and everyone, that then can cobble together deals while the master genocidaire, who ought to be at the Hague for crimes against humanity and the like, continues to pull the strings? Again, as I said, when I met with him in 2005, along with Greg, we talked humanitarianism, access, Darfur camps, the ending of the hostilities, and supporting the Janjaweed. And what did he talk about just about the entire time? Lift the sanctions, lift the sanctions. I met with Secretary Kerry when he was still Chairman John Kerry, when he was still on the Senate side, and he was asking for sanctions relief there. So another question would be the origin of this. Was it a good, positive, natural evolution of now is the time to make a deal to try to help the humanitarian crisis, or was this something that was sought after for a long time that gives us a semblance of, maybe a better situation there, but maybe it doesn't. They're rearming and building up their capabilities, like Iran now, become far more menacing and ominous if they get that capability, buying more battle tanks and fighter jets. And you, Mr. Detoni, in your testimony, you make reference to the Enough Project and their new report entitled Border Control from Hell, how the EU's migration partnership legitimizes Sudan's malicious state. Now, for seemingly very selfish reason, the EU is selling this capability to mitigate the flow of, and here it is, without objection, we'll put the parts of it, certainly the executive summary in, but they're able to mitigate the flow of refugees when we're providing them a capability that could be used for far more nefarious purposes. So if you could speak to that. And then you make the statement, Mr. Detoni, and the others might want to speak to this. On the issue of humanitarian access to the 2 areas, South Kordofan and Nuba Mountains and the Blue Nile State, I do not believe any humanitarian access has crossed the battle lines from Khartoum into the 2 areas. Is that still accurate as of today? In all of your opinions, that would be an important, part of this. And again, why January 17th? Why wasn't this, was that the natural time when this came to fruition for the administration to make this decision? And I ask that, to hand an incoming administration a well-thought-out policy that came to its natural fruition on January 17th to promulgate this, or should it have been done 6 months ago, or not at all, and wait for the new administration to, I'm baffled by the timing of it. As you're going out the door, you say, here, take this. It may be very well crafted, but I just, I would appreciate your insights on that and these other questions, again, like who's in charge for real in Khartoum. Mr. Brooks Rubin.
Thank you, Representative Smith, Chairman Smith. There's a lot there. I guess let me just try to answer a couple, and if I've missed, I'll keep coming back. In terms of the purchases that we've seen, reports and information about what's happening on the ground continue to come in, and we're happy to provide more information on those purchases of interest. I think the bigger point is, and one of the debates around the sanctions lifting is this really going to matter? Does this really change the economic situation on the ground? And I think one thing that's important and reflective of purchases like these are, it opens up the ability for there to be one-time purchases like this. Maybe long-term investment remains questionable because of the overall business environment in Sudan, but now the banking channels are open, without fear of transactions being rejected or blocked by a bank along the way. So you create an enabling environment that then allows a regime to then decide what it's going to do. And again, from our assessment so far, although there have been the cessation of hostilities that's been discussed, the long-term planning that envisions the sanctions being removed altogether is looking ahead to the ability to make these kinds of weapons purchases and really entrench itself further. We're not what we're doing by this policy is essentially enabling the regime to just simply entrench itself further without creating any mechanism to have these discussions about a broader democratic process and peace process in the country, which in some way leads me to the Iran question. And you're absolutely right that human rights has been sort of consistently left off the table in all of these situations. I think what's notable in the Iran example is that we still do maintain a pretty significant level of sanctions. Not all, and certainly has enabled quite a lot of the activity by the Iranian regime, but we still maintain a pretty, at some level, some robust sanctions in place. With Sudan, we're talking about still taking these limited steps, but yet giving away the rest of the existing sanctions program without replacing it with anything, which seems in a positive and really, again, as you said, Mr. Chairman, giving away the concept of human rights. Your reference to Ambassador Natsios is a useful one. In preparing for the hearing, I went back and looked at a press conference that he and Deputy Secretary Negroponte and former OFAC Director and Acting Undersecretary Adam Zubin had way back in 2007 when I was at Treasury, when they announced Plan B, which was the sort of rollout of Darfur sanctions, which was really supposed to put pressure on the regime to stop what was happening in Darfur, to stop a genocide. The sanctions that were announced at those times weren't strong. We were really just identifying companies that were already sanctioned, but we were promised, and Ambassador Natsios' remarks in that press conference really say that we're going to use pressure and we're going to use robust enforcement to really get at these critical issues of human rights, and that pressure was the only way to deal with the regime in Sudan, and we just haven't seen that. We just never saw that happen. Human rights was never truly tied to pressure in any meaningful way, and that's what we think needs to happen now, and you need to have these independently verifiable benchmarks around peace and human rights and religious freedom in order to get there. In terms of the question about sort of where did this come from and where did it originate, and obviously a lot of what was happening within the administration isn't entirely clear, but it does certainly seem to us that this was, at least the decisions at the end about what sanctions relief to put on the table seemed hastily created and sort of, as you said, sort of handing the next administration here. We're giving you something that you need to make sure you deal with, and to continue the process going. Obviously, something was needed in order to keep the Sudanese engaged, but it certainly did not ever appear to be a sort of, as you were indicating, may have been preferable, a long explained and thought out process. This was something that was really only kind of announced at the very end, and there wasn't the level of deliberation and at least engagement with the NGO community that we had at the very end. And the executive order says there has to be consultation with the NGOs moving forward. But what that process was, why we got there, wasn't really ever clearly established. So I think I'll stop with those for now, and happy to come back and address the others.
Who's in charge? Did you want to touch on that briefly?
Who's in charge? I mean, I think that's a question maybe others may be better placed to answer than me specifically. I think it is a real question that I think we all struggle to really understand. And I think as we've looked at the violent kleptocratic network that the regime and its insiders have established, you have to, I mean, clearly we have to deal with President Bashir, but there are a lot of other key actors, key advisors, and really these entities like the NIS and key corporations that really also play an important role. And I think we haven't really talked about the impact of the Gulf and the dynamic between the way the government of Sudan, the sort of shifting alliances between Iran and the Gulf, and the role that the countries in the Gulf play, both in terms of investments that they have within, or if you want to call them investments, essentially giveaways by the government of Sudan in exchange for cooperation. So I think the role of the Gulf is also critical to explore here in terms of the broader picture of who's in charge.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me try to deal with some of these questions as well. Who calls the shots? Well, I think it's always been a mistake for people around him to underestimate President Bashir. He has solidified his control. He's managed to move people around when they get too powerful. Not long ago, he dismissed two very powerful people, Vice President Taha and Nafi al-Nafi, and who knows, they may come back 6 months from now. They were both very powerful people. There are two military organizations. There's the regular military, and there's the NIS, which controls the militias, the so-called Janjaweed. Now it's called the Rapid, what's it called, the RDF or whatever it's called. So you have power centers there, all of which the president uses to, frankly, maintain his own position, protect his own interests, etc. Now he's appointed a prime minister, Prime Minister Bakri. Bakri is someone very close to the president. I think he feels that Bakri is someone who will also protect his interests. So you have an autocratic system, but with someone who plays powerful interests against each other. Now, it also is true, going to another question, that there are people with different opinions about where the country ought to go. There are a number of people who understand that the system that they've been operating for a long time, where you keep the outlying areas at bay through fighting, through co-optation, through exploitation, whatever, keep the power at the center, is draining the country and will keep draining the country. And there are people like former Minister Ghazi and others who have spoken out on this and written about how to democratize the country, et cetera. There are people who want a better relationship with the United States and understand. There are other people who feel very, very differently, that all our talk about human rights and peace is a danger to the security of the regime. And as long as they consider human rights and accommodation a danger to the security of the regime, they're going to fight against it. And the difficulty for us outsiders is, how do you engage in that situation? And you try and engage, encouraging the people who are thinking differently and trying to counter the arguments of those on the other side. And it's going to be slow, and it's going to be a very difficult process, and we have to keep working it. Now, the origin of the EO, actually, it's a product of about 2.5 years of debate inside the administration. First, whether we should have such a dialogue at all, whether the Sudanese were open to it. And you have to remember that my successor, Don Booth, couldn't get a visa to Sudan for over a year. So the question was, how do you relate? So it was a long, tough debate. And then toward the end, what are the elements of the debate? Got to the end of the administration, they put it out there, and I realized it puts suddenly something on the next administration. I think the 6 months is because these are very limited conditions, very limited benchmarks. And if you had them out there for a year, it could last but not move you any farther. At least that's my interpretation. You have to ask the people. Now, I'd like to talk a little bit more about humanitarian access, because some of us for many years have been fighting this issue over humanitarian access, and others have, et cetera. But it's been a political football by both sides, okay? Sometimes the opposition says that's our number one concern, and sometimes they say, well, it has to be linked to the political dialogue. There are people in the government who don't want humanitarian access because they do believe that, without it, it weakens the opposition. They're also afraid of weapons coming in and all of that. But we got very close to an agreement on I'd say, under Thabo Mbeki, very close to an agreement on humanitarian access. And the opposition said, okay, we're all for it, except it has to come, at least some of it has to come from Ethiopia. Can't just all come from Sudan. Now, you can argue as whether you think that was a worthwhile condition to hold it all up. The government didn't agree with that, and both of them are playing games because it's related to whether they're really willing to move beyond that to a political dialogue. And the people who suffer are the people in the two areas. And I'm personally unsympathetic with both sides on this particular issue, but it does go to the complexity of the negotiations. Humanitarian access really has to be linked to an understanding in the two areas that it's not a one-time thing. It's got to be part of a process where you have a cessation of hostilities and have a political process. If it's a one-time thing, it'll break up in 6 months and won't accomplish more than that immediate.
Piggybacking on some of your comments, I agree, and that the ceasefire and the humanitarian assistance are got to be linked for it to last, and I think that's the justification. I mean, we've seen some hope because the fighting is really slowed or ceased, and for me, we do need to try to give peace a chance. Unfortunately, we have to incentivize Khartoum. I also think Khartoum has played America very well. I mean, they're very good poker players. I wouldn't go to a casino if they were dealing, and that is respect for their intellect and their capability. And as far as Bashir and the people who's got in power, I think that they assume that we forget. I think that they can overwhelm us with problems and complexities. But at the end of the day, I do agree. I think that who's still in power? Mr. Bashir. I mean, Hassan al-Turabi, who was, the intellectual behind in the power, the brains, whatever you call it, behind the National Islamic Front when they took over, when Bashir and he took over power in 1989. Well, he's dead. Mr. Bashir's still in power, and I've heard anecdotally from other people who have been close to Mr. Bashir that he knows what he's doing. He knows the people around him. He knows very well how to play each other off of each other and how to stay in power. I also think that we do need to look at their actions, not what they say. I mean, they'll say what we want to hear. I think they'll say to diplomats what we want to hear, and smart diplomats and wise diplomats like Ambassador Lyman know that. But we have to, like, for instance, religious freedom, okay? I mean, that's often, Mr. Wolf said it, you said it, but it's a canary in the coal mine, particularly in regions like Khartoum and the issues that are going on there. And all we have to do is look at the past several months. The Czech pastor who was arrested, complicated reasons why. I mean, he snuck into the mountains, took footage. They caught him when he was in Khartoum, not the smartest thing to do. But then they arrested 2 Sudanese pastors who evidently were at a religious freedom conference in Addis, the intelligence network for Khartoum were there videotaping it, like they're probably in the crowd here videotaping this. And so they locked them up when they went back to Khartoum. So for me, the nature of that, let's call it a government, a regime, is that, you know, they're fundamentally, I don't think, believe in religious freedom. Hassan Turabi changed his tune about 10 years ago, started writing about religious freedom, and because we were down there talking to him, other people were talking to him, so he thought, oh, I can curry favor with the West. But I think you have to look back to the 90s with what they did and to justify their violent and militant attacks against America and our allies. And the type of people that are willing to do that and are still in power, what are they really about? And I think we need to know that. Now, we also need to give peace a chance. We can't just forget it and walk away. And we're signatories and we led the peace process, President Bush, for the South and for Sudan, and we have a moral obligation, but it's also in our security interest to do so. You had asked about the humanitarian assistance, if anything's gone in through the battle lines, and to my knowledge, no. Across the front lines, no. Ambassador Lyman, I think, already touched on some of the rationale behind it. I've heard that the opposition looked at what happened in Darfur and they said, no way, we're not allowing that to happen again. I don't know all the details of what happened in Darfur, but I've heard that security really monitored, not to monitor, but controlled what was going on, what was going on out. And I know that, like in a lot of other countries, not just in Sudan, but Sudan looks at, you know, refugees as a security issue. And you don't know which aid workers, the Red Crescent or whoever else like that, is working for their intelligence service or for some security apparatus there. You know, if you walk as a Catholic bishop or a Catholic priest with a truckload of grain or something like that, whatever, that's just pure humanitarian goods to go in, I mean, the chances of you getting that through, in my opinion, would be, all of it through would be slim. On the refugee situation, specifically to Eritrea that I wrote about, I had a European official who works on refugee issues tell me. I said, you have a lot of Eritrean refugees coming here to Europe. You must be excited about that, or what have you. And he's like, no, we're not. And we don't want them. They can't speak any. They're very unskilled, very uneducated. They're traumatized from what happened to them when they had to serve in the military. And the report that you all did it enough. I mean, it catalogs this. The Europeans don't want the Eritreans coming because they're a threat to their society to have them there, because they could be lawless, uncontrollable, and that sort of thing. Lastly, I think that I have great respect. I've never served as a special envoy. The pressures that are there are, and the kind of work that you have to do, very difficult. I think that Special Envoy Booth, I didn't understand it, but he's sort of in a very cerebral, smart, but I think he sort of lost control when he was at the USIP giving comments before he left. And he singled out the SPLM North in particular and blamed them for the humanitarian assistance agreement falling apart. I don't think envoys should do that very often. And I think what he said was, these people, and he also was referring to all of the leaders are serving themselves more than their people. But then, as Ambassador Lyman said in his remarks, the SPLM North itself is having some issues right now. I mean, one of the top figures wants self-determination, to ill-defined, whereas some of the others say, no, that's not, we belong as a unified, kind of John Garang's vision of a new Sudan, democratic participation. And so I felt like that they were pushing so hard for whatever reason, maybe for Mr. Obama's legacy. I don't understand why, but I think that whoever takes over as envoy, whoever inherits this portfolio, within the Trump administration is going to have to walk some of that back. The other thing, I've said it before, but we have a lot of dedicated career professionals in the State Department and all over, but you know, right now our Africa policy and our Sudan and South Sudan policy is rudderless, and it won't have a rudder until Mr. Trump gets his people in the key positions. And so I don't think, you know, if I were Khartoum or if I were the opposition members, I wouldn't, if I got an email from or a conversation from somebody in the State Department right now, I wouldn't pay any attention to it. I would say, who, you know, put a Trump person in there and I'll deal with you. It'd be the same if it was a Democrat administration. You've got to have your own people in to do the work and have some guidance from the top in order to have the credibility and to get some things done. So I think we're in a real holding pattern. That's another reason why I suggest 180 days long or a year, because it's going to take a few more months till we get some key people in at the White House and in the bureaucracy to handle these issues.
I would like to get back to you about all these points in writing in details, but I want to build on one point that was made about the question of who's in charge. Definitely agree it's al-Bashir who's in charge, and I think where this is coming from, what is calling the shot at the end of the day, I believe it's not ideology or foreign power. I think it's money at the end of the day. And I think the only way to get that kind of change in human rights and religious freedom, as Lyman said, if there are elements in there that will always push aside human rights as something that is part of something on the table. And I think the way to go about it is to make human rights profitable. It's to make it the thing on the table, the main thing, and religious freedom and human rights the thing to negotiate about, not something additional on the table that they can cast aside. And yeah, with that, that's all I wanted to say about that.
Thank you. We're almost finished because we do have to be out of here by 5, but I just wanted to ask maybe a lightning round here. Do we need a Sudan special envoy again? I'm thinking of introducing a bill. It shouldn't take a bill. The president could do it with a snap of his fingers. But is that needed? Is it a recommendation you would make? Secondly, you know, Juba and South Sudan, and Greg and I were in Juba last August, meeting with Salva Kiir, pressing these issues of humanitarian access, to end to sexual violence, and now, sadly, a famine. That has kind of taken the eyes off of Khartoum and put them squarely to the south. Has Khartoum then exploited that lack of scrutiny that they are not getting to the degree they used to? The church leaders, and that would include Muslim, Christian, the imams, all the church leaders, are they being used effectively in any kind of interfaith effort to try to, or is that a non-starter? And finally, UNAMID, we met with UNMISS when we were in South Sudan. The Security Council has made some very significant changes to their operating procedures, especially after the debacle in the terrain compound, and when they did not act. And I did have the privilege of speaking to the Security Council. I was invited, as I said earlier, by Nikki Haley to be at Blair House, to be one of 4 members presenting. And I pointed out, and they were obviously the ones that are in charge of this, ultimately. They've made some very significant systemic reforms. Hopefully they pan out well going forward. But Unamid, your thoughts on that? Is their mandate sufficient? Are they doing what they should do? And then anything you would want to add, please do, and then we'll conclude.
I can start quickly on that. Thank you. I think the administration is reviewing how many special envoys they ought to have for what purposes. I think in this case, there should be a special envoy. empowered, as Mr. Titoni had said, because the kind of negotiations that need to be done on both Sudan and South Sudan require high-level attention. Has to be someone who speaks for the president, people know he speaks or she speaks for the president, and can engage on hard negotiations in both North and South. You know, there wasn't as much attention to Sudan lately as, and thank you for this hearing, because South Sudan is such an overwhelming problem. But I think it's coming back as we look at this EO and the issues that are being raised and the kinds of the decisions. But I do think it's important when you talk about Sudan, it goes to a question Mr. Garrett raised, they are players in the South Sudan situation. They've pulled back on some of their support for the opposition. That was part of the understanding in this track. But there's much more to be done on South Sudan. IGAD is divided. They are major players in IGAD. I would like to see them step up much more constructively. On UNMISS, I think they have improved in management, but they are limited. Right now, they are overwhelmed with their protection of the people who are right in those POCs. They're called protection of civilian areas. They don't really intercede between the government and the opposition. The fighting's going on. They don't have quite the capacity, let alone the mandate. So they are not, they're relevant and can be more relevant for protection. They're not relevant, quite frankly, to stopping the fighting.
All for your expertise. If nobody else wants to comment, let me just say, did you?
Maybe just 2 seconds on the Envoy question. I apologize. I mean, I think we generally would agree with that. I think the bigger issue is what Mr. Titoni said is, in order to have an envoy who's going to really make an impact, you need a policy. And until there are policymakers clearly in place, an envoy runs the risk of not being able to advance clear policy and not being taken seriously, as Mr. Tony said. So, I think our perspective is, if there is a clear policy and a strong policy, and then someone who can clearly and strongly carry it out with a clear backing of the administration that is clear to Khartoum as the backing of the administration, as again Mr. Tony made clear, then that's important. And I think the last point I wanted to make by jumping in is just, this is where there is clearly a role for Congress and clearly a role for this committee to make clear what are the priorities and what needs to be done now in this. While there is this uncertainty, this is really when Congress needs to act and take the mantle by establishing what are the policies that really matter and what are the mechanisms and measures we need in order to achieve them. So I think that's ultimately where
Does that
where we
mean
can
new
end.
Legislation or just?
It could, yeah. I mean, it should.
Any
It
thoughts
should.
you have
It
on
should.
that,
It should
please?
mean legislation. We've, there's a proposal that I think would have a lot of these measures in them and outline the diplomatic track that's needed to get at the human rights and peace track that we talked about. So yes, it's legislation. It's also, clearly indicating to the administration these are what the priorities are. But
You did say in your testimony it should be delinked from the 5 tracks. Why
Yes.
wouldn't it be incorporated?
Well, I think from our perspective, the 5 tracks have they have their own trajectory. They have their own limited set of issues they're dealing with. What we're talking about are much bigger issues that need much different pressures. And so, in some ways, let's not muddy the waters on either side. Let's kind of keep 2 sets going. So,
Sudan and South Sudan, the whole issue has traditionally had very good bipartisan support. It in a town right now that's, as you know better than we, it's hard to work with the other parties, whichever party you're in right now. And this is a winner as far as bipartisan approach. And I know that you're willing to work on issues with everybody, but the president and others, this could be a winner and a good way to develop some relationships, because at the end of the day, working with the other side of the aisle is always about relationships, not always about party politics. I want to underscore what I wrote in the testimony, what Ambassador Lyman said, though. I think I'm not trying to You know, if a tree falls in, you know, in North Carolina, I'm not blaming Khartoum all the time. You know, but this was their policy for years and years and years to destabilize South Sudan. The rebel movements, they were very good at it in the North-South, call it that war. They have a network, they have the capability to run everybody, and they can run circles in some ways around destabilizing South Sudan. So if you're able to get that classified review, I would really ask to know the history of that to the extent that you have the time to listen, and to know what's halted in their opinion and what's continued. And this needs to be on the table because the two countries, you know, they were one country for a long time. They're linked. Their futures are linked. If they're not getting along, then there's going to be destabilizing and massive humanitarian issues. So that's one thing I would not
It's
let
an
go
excellent
of.
point. Yesterday, Greg and I did get a classified briefing. We want to include others and make it, and now that we have even more questions to ask, we'll do another one, but it's a great idea. Because we always want to not do something unwittingly to damage what is being done if it's been well thought out. So I can't talk about the briefing, obviously, but we did have one yesterday. But your point is very well taken about getting Royce, Engel, Karen Bass, and I, and others all to do it. Thank you for that. I deeply appreciate it. We appreciate it, the subcommittee. Your information, we will get it over to the state, but more importantly, to some of the people at the White House, hopefully, because obviously we benefit from your expertise and wisdom, Congress and the executive branch. So thank you so very, very much. The hearing's adjourned.
Hey, my friend. Well done.
Thank you so much for calming me down.
No, you're great.
Yeah, it's all relevant.